My name's Jamie Pang. I use she, her pronouns, and I am currently the Senior Environmental Health Program Director at the Oregon Environmental Council. We are a statewide environmental policy and advocacy group here based in Portland. I'm also the board secretary at 350 PDX, which is the climate justice organization. And so I guess I'll say that I come from an environmental law background. I graduated from Lewis and Clark Law School with an environmental law degree. And I originally started off in conservation and wildlife before I went to energy litigation under the PUC in California. Then I made my way back up here to work for OEC, and now my portfolio and work centers air quality, toxic chemicals and product, climate and health impacts such as worker protections, and being on various advisory committees, working groups, and rulemaking advisory committees on the state level. I am not a scientist, but I use science and technology, and I work with scientists to enact policy and law changes on behalf of the environment and human health in everything I do. So that's a lot of data. That's a lot of academic papers that I could be citing as well. And I'll leave it at that.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Jamie. Kat, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Absolutely. My name is Kat. As you can tell, I'm from Australia. I was actually born in New Zealand, but I grew up in Australia. And I have always loved nature, and I think that's what's drawn me towards environmental science. I love backpacking, love swimming in mountain lakes, and I think that's always been, the root of all my passion and curiosity in this area. I studied, oh my God, wombats. Yes, they've square poop, if anyone doesn't know about wombats. I don't know. There's some great poetry about square poop wombats. I'll see if I can find it later and share it with you all. Anyway, back on track. I did a Bachelor of Science at the University of Melbourne, majoring in zoology and biochemistry. I then took a little bit of a change in my career path and did Teach for Australia, which is very similar to Teach for America. I taught out in the desert in Australia for a number of years, middle school and high school science, focusing on biology and chemistry. And after a time, I kept feeling this pull back to research, and then wanted to sort of dive into that a bit more deeply. So I went back to uni and started researching aquaculture. So not agriculture, aquaculture. So particularly looking at salmon farms and pest management and sustainability in those settings, which are very challenging and very interesting because you've got these high density populations. And that can create, some big problems for the environment. But then on the other hand, it's a really wonderful potential way to feed the world in a sustainable way. Aquaculture is lots of possibilities. So I did that for a while, researching, working in Norway, working in New Zealand, working in Australia. But then I sort of got pulled back into the education world. So I am currently the head of Style USA, which is a science education company. We're the biggest middle school science curriculum in Australia, and we're just starting out in the US, and our headquarters are here in Portland. And while we do cover all of the sciences at Style, and you're not supposed to have favorites, it's like children. I definitely love our environmental science content most, and we're always working with scientists to communicate to students about what the latest breaking news is in the world, to tell stories about women in STEM or underrepresented people in STEM. And it's a really exciting position, and so exciting to be able to share more about science and get more young people excited about science. Anyway, that is me. I'll pass on to Amanda.
Thank you so much, Kat. Yeah, Amanda, why don't you take a couple minutes to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, everyone, and thanks for being here and for the invite. I'm excited to be here with you all. I've been reading in the chat and excited to hear what you all are up to. So my name is Amanda Ingmeyer. I am a senior policy analyst at the Department of Environmental Quality. And my background has been quite winding getting to this point. I studied a number of things in undergrad, but ended up getting my bachelor's in environmental design, and then going to my master's degree for architecture, which seems, a little bit strange sometimes when we're talking about environmental sciences, but there is quite a significant amount of building science in the architecture and built environment space. And in particular, I was really focused on sustainability and equity in that work. And through all of that, that is how I have found myself at DEQ now, where I am focused on specifically built environment. I lead our built environment program at DEQ. And we are really focused on kind of the built environment writ large, which, what does that really mean? It really is kind of any place that we interact with day to day, from our homes to our offices, our transit, how we get internet or utilities or other services into our homes. And then more broadly, where are those materials coming from that help create these spaces and services for us? And what are the impacts of those materials across their life cycle? Because they aren't just happening where we're experiencing those materials. They are coming from all over the world, and they are having health and environmental and social justice impacts. And so a lot of the work that I'm really focused on at DEQ is on addressing what those impacts are, where they're happening, and how we can develop policies and programs in order to reduce those impacts. And I'm sure I'll talk more about some of that as we get into some of the questions. So for now, I'll stop there.
Incredible. I love it. Thank you so much, Amanda. You guys are absolutely amazing to have in this panel today. Your backgrounds are so diverse and really a great example of you can be in environmental science from so many different starting points. And also then how wide-reaching environmental science really is to everyone, how applicable it is to everyone. All right, so we will move on to our first question of the day. So how did you hear about your career and what sparked your interest? And we're gonna start with, Amanda, why don't we just throw it right back to you?
Okay, that sounds great. Yeah, I started my career just because I had an interest in the built environment. That's how I ended up going through the architecture path and becoming an architect. And I didn't say this in my intro, but I worked in the industry for about over 10 years before I decided to make this leap over to DEQ. And so I'll talk mostly about that. How did I end up at DEQ? And really how I ended up here was because I was starting to find that there was a really strong need to work on policy and advocacy to make real change. It wasn't happening directly in the industry. It didn't matter what my role was. It didn't matter what power or decision making I had in a firm. I felt stuck, and I felt like we weren't doing good enough. And so I started doing a lot of advocacy and policy work in my spare time, and ultimately ended up hosting an event for something called Sustainable Building Week that happens every year in Portland. And at that event met someone at DEQ and learned about this job opportunity to jump into the built environment work at the agency. And so that for me really felt like it flipped the switch, and I was like, okay, this is great. I don't lose everything I worked so hard on in the architecture space. I still get to work on all of that, but I get to focus on what I think is actually really important, what it is that we do with the built environment, how it impacts people's lives, how it impacts our environment. And I really get to focus on helping to make change in that space. So it was through just kind of, events like this where you get to kind of have these conversations and see how other people are finding places in the space to do what you're really passionate about. And so it was from there that all just worked out. I learned about the job, applied, ended up at DEQ, and really excited to be there.
Amazing. I love it. Networking. Heck yes. Kat, why don't we throw it to you next? We'll just go in reverse order of our introductions.
Yeah, for sure. So it was, how did I hear about my career and how did I?
Yes. And
Right.
what sparked your interest in it?
Yeah, I think both for my work in education and science, it comes down to the fact that I'm a massive nerd and I just really love learning. And that's kind of what made me want to go into education. I wanted more students to love learning as much as I do. And then it's what made me pursue research, because I wanted to do more learning because it made my brain feel good. And then in terms of environmental science specifically, I think it comes down to just that real passion for the outdoors and for nature and making sure that the world we live in is respected. And then I guess more recently moving into business as opposed to, academia or government, like public schools sort of sectors, I really felt that I got really excited about what educational technology and science education could do and how fast it can move, especially compared to schools. The change that you can make in that space is amazing because you have enough money to pay the best people and give them the best resources to get, real change making work done as quickly as possible in a really efficient way. So that's kind of what led me into the more ed tech business world. And I really like it. And the fact that, for me, getting these kids a world-class science education is something I'm deeply passionate about, and has sort of been, it feels like a really good place for me to be right now, even though I've done lots of different things. So it's kind of threads all of those together.
I love it. Thank you, Kat. Jamie, what about you? How did you hear about your career and what sparked your interest about it?
Thanks. I've actually gone through several career changes if you consider college and the college track. So I know some of you guys are in college, so just wanted to put it out there that having your major completely decided and sticking with it is definitely not the end all be all. And so I actually started off in psychiatry and psychology when I was at University of California in San Diego. So I was likely going to be in some sort of STEM career anyways. And in college, I spent a lot of time in the psychiatry and psychology labs. But oddly enough, I ended up in really interested in environmental work, and environmental work generally, field work, policy, anything that would do something to help the environment. After a trip in New Zealand, actually, where I was doing ecology field work and invasive species removal. This was mainly because I actually spent my childhood in East LA and I did not have any nature around me. And so when I saw so much green and lush landscapes, it actually changed me to the point where I wanted to focus my life on it. And that obviously what drew me to Oregon for law school as well. I picked my location of law school based on where I wanted to be. And so as far as I love animals, but I eventually wanted to do environmental health and work on human health issues because I wanted to use some of that lived experience and also that community experience that, we hear a lot about within our partners and community groups to actually enact policy changes. And so that was one of the reasons for sort of going from wildlife conservation, which I'll always have an interest in, but to this. So one example is that recently during the legislative long session, we passed what was called the Toxic Free Cosmetics Act, and that used some of the lived experience of people that had been injured by toxic chemicals, mostly products that have been marketed towards women of color, like we were talking about formaldehyde releasers, to advocate for the removal of such chemicals as well, using the science behind it of why, and showing that on the market that it's possible to remove these chemicals, and the clean cosmetics companies have done it, and it's affordable. And so that's one example of just wanting to use that science for good, in addition to like that community need. And we also work with DEQ a lot too. So nice to meet you, Amanda.
Awesome. Oh, thank you so much, Jamie. Honestly, I love the fact that you all had such huge shifts in your careers. Like I'm hearing a lot of like finding what was important to you specifically and following that passion within environmental science, right? And making things better for the world around you. I love that takeaway. Do it for the passion and you'll have fulfilling work. That's amazing. Let's move on to our next question. What has been the most rewarding part of your career, or was there a particular moment that was especially meaningful? Let's start with Amanda. Let's keep this order.
Yeah. Wow. This question. I think maybe what I'll share is not necessarily one specific moment, but is essentially kind of how I've been able to do my work at DEQ. And Jamie, I'm excited that we're meeting as well, and excited to connect more after this. And I think what's been really rewarding is the shift I kind of talked about of moving into something that felt like I was having positive impact that I was looking for. And in particular, I'll just mention a few projects. So, and just for context, where I sit in DEQ is a program called Materials Management. And so it's kind of this strange little section in DEQ where we are not necessarily the permit writers or the people doing a lot of the regulatory work. We do have some regulatory work in our program, but we also do a lot of initiatives and research and, working with community members, working with students, working with other industries in order to kind of like move forward things that haven't necessarily been required, whether that's via legislation or policies. So we touch a bit of a number of different things. And so what has been really rewarding in that is the ability to really define what our work is. And how we've done that is when we developed our first strategic plan for the Built Environment program, we brought in a lot of people from across the agency as well as outside of the agency to help us understand what should we really be working on? What is it that people want to see? And from there, we kind of developed a framework, but we were really clear, like, we don't want to have a set number of projects with 14 people sitting at a table. Instead, we want to say kind of what is the framework we use for our decision making. And the one project that was really advocated for from all the folks sitting on our steering committee was now go out and do listening sessions around the state, because you've heard from us, but you need to hear from more people. Like, if a topic area is housing, if a topic area is toxicity of materials, if a topic area is infrastructure and that kind of access, what does that mean for people around the state? Because we have started doing those listening sessions, and we've heard something very different in Halem than we've heard in Ontario, than we've heard in Hood River. And so it has been really, really rewarding that this career has offered the opportunity to foster those relationships, have those conversations, be willing to say, we're going to do work based on what we're hearing from community and people's lived experience on the ground in their built environments, because we're all experiencing these spaces, and we're all impacted by them differently. And a lot of that is based on historic policies and current policies. And so that piece has been really rewarding. And as another part of that is really getting the opportunity, I mentioned working with students. We were able to co-host it's an after-school program for high school youth who are BIPOC or femme and non-binary, to really understand how design can show up in their space and how they can use design for racial justice. And so we were able to co-host one of their cohorts focused on climate justice and environmental justice. And we've been able to, co-teach courses at U of O for different design students. And so getting into this pedagogy, and Kat, thinking about you, of just like, how do we start to do this work moving forward in a way that's different and that is more equitable for folks. So I'll stop there, but that's been something I've really loved about my job.
Incredible. That is amazing. Kat, would you like to talk about the meaningful parts of your job?
Yeah, for sure. I think maybe I'll touch on two things and just make them a little bit quicker instead of one longer one. Maybe we'll see how this goes. I think when I was researching the things that I found most rewarding, you put huge amounts of work into it. I know some people in the chat are already in research or writing papers and those sorts of pieces. You put in years of work, and when you do get your first paper published, it is incredibly rewarding, and even more so if they're results that can have impact on industry or impact on communities. And I was lucky enough that some of the research I was undertaking has impacted the way that salmon are farmed and the way that pest management is undertaken in those settings. And it was really nice and rewarding to see that little cherry on top of all of the science and getting seasick on the boats and all that sort of stuff. And then it's in my sort of more science education focused role now. I think for me, my big why that I always come back to, and the reason why I find it rewarding to be here, is that I know teaching is just such a hard job, and I just want to do everything I can to make teachers' lives easier and students' outcomes better, and make the classroom a more fun, rewarding place. And I spend at least a day in a school every week at the moment, and I love working directly with teachers and students and seeing the impact that things that we build based on research and customer feedback can have on a daily basis in the classroom. So yeah, I think that's me.
Awesome. I love that. Jamie, what about you? How's your career been very meaningful to you?
Yeah, I think there's one particular thing at OEC, at least at my tenure in OEC, that was especially meaningful. And I guess it centers around being able to bring in the scientists and the science in being able to enact those policy changes. There were what is called the Oregon OSHA heat and smoke rules that I'm sure the folks in the agencies are aware of. Is basically Oregon OSHA was directed by the governor to come up with worker protections in light of heat and smoke because of climate change. And that was a pretty big lift and coalition lift. But ultimately, after we were actually in rulemaking during the 2020 heat dome and during the time that Sebastian Perez, the farm worker, died of heat illness that summer as well. And so ultimately, we used the CDC NIOSH the work and break chart that they had, which is from the 90s, by the way. So science has shown that heat is really bad for human health. And we also worked with scientists from I think the University of Washington or Washington State, who have authored papers on things like epidemiology to come up with what's currently considered the nation's strongest heat and smoke rules. And so they're considered the strongest rules because the protections kick in at 80 degrees due to acclimatization of Oregonians and things like that, and call for shade and extra paid breaks and whatnot. And so I guess the most meaningful thing was that ultimately, like, we use that for advocacy to be able to save lives in light of climate change.
Wow. That was a lot of very, very important topics that you all just covered. Yeah, definitely meaningful work that you've all been doing. And it sounds like visible work, right? Like tangible results has been key to each of your positions, right? Creating change within communities, and particularly driven by data. Like, that's awesome. Being able to bring each of those things into your own work. That's amazing. How many times can I say amazing in this panel? So let's move on to our next question. And I wanted to highlight at this point that, this is a panel put on by women in STEM, women in science, in Portland. And so we're looking at things perhaps a little bit differently than a lot of other events that are similarly themed, right? We're looking at it from a female perspective. And so I would like to ask each of you what the biggest challenge you faced in your career, and how you were able to deal with it. And also, this is your opportunity to address the fact that you all are women in science, and that is a unique perspective that is often not talked about. And so we're talking to a lot of young women who are looking to go into environmental science and perhaps have not had an opportunity to hear about these kinds of experiences. So let's start with Amanda. Your biggest challenge that you faced so far in your career, with the perspective as a woman, and how you were able to handle it.
Yeah, thanks, Cece, for this question, and also the setup around just what it means to be a woman in this particular field or set of fields, because really the biggest challenge has been throughout is being a woman in these fields. It is the misogyny and the assumption that comes with male-dominated fields. And so, I've experienced that in a lot of different ways. I've seen it in really direct ways, as far as like being in meetings and being the person in charge of a meeting and leading a whole meeting and giving the whole presentation, and then having folks across the table only talk to my male colleague next to me, who I invited as a courtesy. And I have seen it in lower pay, and I have seen it in clients who refuse to call me back, but will call my male colleague back immediately. So I've seen it in so many different ways. And it is really, really hard and frustrating. And sometimes just feels like, I remember at one point I was like, why is the thing I'm passionate about sustainability, and I also happen to be a woman, and all of these things are such a challenge? And why couldn't I have picked something easier, and it happened to be something that would be easier? But what I will say, as far as overcoming that, is the power of finding your people, like finding the people in this group on this call today, the people in your organizations who are going through the same things. It helps you validate what you're feeling, when sometimes you may start to feel like, am I making this up? Is this all in my head? Is it just, the trauma of having dealt with this in the past and I'm just overreacting? It really helps to have someone you can call and they can be like, no, you're totally valid. I did that a year ago with my former boss. I called her and I was like, this is what's going on. I am so frustrated, but I'm not sure if I'm just like reading too much into this. And she was like, no, you're not. That is exactly what's going on. It's complete BS and you absolutely can and should do something about it. So just like having that community around, finding people to support you, and then also figuring out like how do we support each other in this space? How do we speak up in meetings to support each other? How do we tell each other what our salaries are so we make sure we're all being paid equally? And that includes bringing men into that conversation. It has always helped define the allies who are male, who are willing to share and find out like, oh, you got hired at a higher salary than me. Oh, you got a raise then when they told me I couldn't, etc. So that's what I'd say. Find your people, be willing to have those hard conversations, and we continue to band together. And through all the hard things, it helps. I will, and maybe one last quick thing, I will say that I have found it to be a lot better in my current role than it has been in any of my previous roles. I don't know what that is, but I will say that I also really appreciate that. So I think, Cece, maybe you said something about this earlier with the transition. I think not being afraid to transition if something's not working is also a big part of that. And that comes from like the passion of what you're doing, but also just how you're treated in your workplace. So I'll leave it there.
I love that. Find your people, find your community. That is such a huge thing. And also trusting your gut, right? Like you said, call your person for validation, your sounding block. Definitely trust your gut. Sherry Beth, you just shared in the chat that you started your career in engineering in the late 80s and how frustrating it is that women in male-dominated fields are still having to deal with these challenges. And absolutely, yes. That is why we host these events. We need to talk about it. We need to let incoming professionals know what they're potentially going to be facing and have the energy to do something about it. I love it. Kat, would you like to talk about some of the challenges you faced and how you were able to overcome it?
Yeah, for sure. I'd echo, a lot of what Amanda just spoke to, including, and I still find this shocking. Like I've had similar, like kind of devastating moments when you find out you're paid a lot less than someone doing the same job as you just because of your gender. And so it's definitely something to still look out for, which is sad. And then sort of prepare yourself to have the conversations or, move to a place that's going to value you for what you do. I think when I was thinking about this, something that's kind of interesting is that because I've straddled both education and science, and particularly aquaculture, there's a lot of bros who like fishing, who study aquaculture. And like it was fine, but I never felt super included in in that world. I think if I'd persisted, it like continued to stay in academia, it would have been totally fine, and it was totally fine. But there is a stark difference between that world and the world of education, which is actually quite female dominated, and it's a very beautiful community. It is just something, I think if I'd decided to continue to stay in academia, it would have been fine, but it does feel much cozier in terms of the people around me in the education world. I think the yes and on top of what Amanda talked to is that something like I actually love challenges, and it's really, a great opportunity for growth a lot of the time. It sucks when they're, just totally out of your control or not your fault or completely, just part of it's a societal side of things. But I think one challenge I've really sort of worked on and developed is just figuring out what my voice as a leader is, because I think sometimes, or for me personally, it can be easy as a leader to fall into like a maternal role almost, which isn't actually the type of leader I want to be. I think a lot of people can follow that pathway in leadership really successfully, but I think I was defaulting to it rather than being like, this is my leadership voice, just because that sort of felt like the easy thing that society expected me to be as a leader. And I think, yeah, just really processing, thinking and training and talking to mentors about, who I want to be as a leader and what I want my leadership voice to be has been, it's an ongoing challenge, and it's something that I want to continue working on. One little shout out I'd make to is the Harvard Business Review's Women at Work podcast. That's been a really useful tool to just thinking about different ways that you can be a leader and be authentic to yourself and not just fall into what the world expects you to do. Yeah, I will go find it, and I'll pass back to Cece.
Amazing. I love that reflection on gender roles in the workplace, right? Like we're all very familiar with gender roles at home, but like gender roles in the workplace, women defaulting to what they're expected to do versus what do you actually want to do or feel comfortable doing, or envision your workplace being, is definitely it takes a lot of energy for sure, to challenge those pre-installed roles. But yeah, that's huge. I love that. That is a great perspective. Jamie, would you like to address some challenges in your career and how you dealt with them?
Yeah, I echo everything that Kat and Amanda have said very, very well. I would say that there's also a lot of bros in the legal field as well. And I myself have left past jobs for pay discrepancies as well. I think, there's also, in addition to sexism, there's also racism. And that, I think, also leads to a lot of emotional burnout. I will also share a pattern that I've observed, which is a lot of, at least because we are an advocacy group and we are an advocacy nonprofit, I've noticed that a lot of the representatives of corporations and those wanting to keep the status quo tend to be male, and they also tend to be white as well, right? So it's their status quo on top of status quo. And so I try to overcome it, or I guess I'm not trying to sound petty, but I do get a kick out of ruining their day sometimes. And I do that by bringing in, the cats of the world, the scientists that I see their paper, for example. And I'm like, hey, you would be great to testify or sit in on this meeting. I'll prep you. I'll cite your work and things like that. And because I have the legal background unfortunately, you have to be better. You have to be better, more on top of it, and you have to work harder. And when you get to that point and they can't, the opposition, for lack of a better term, can't really pull any fast ones on you, they then tend to take yourself more seriously. They tend to take you seriously. And I'll also say that I also have a similar experience. Here in Oregon at OEC, we have an almost all-female policy team, and our executive director is also female as well. And so it is very refreshing. And much of it is also finding that sort of tribe, but also it to me, it seems like Oregon's a little bit better in that regard, and that we should certainly keep encouraging that.
Oh, that's awesome. Absolutely encouraging diversity within your own organization, making the inclusions if no one else is. That's such a good, I love that. And also thank you so much for touching on the topic of racism in the workplace too. Like absolutely, that is a huge issue as well. And I as a white woman, I can't imagine having to deal with both at the same time. So kudos to you. That's amazing. So yeah, there's definitely in male dominated and white dominated industries, it's tough. But I definitely want to remind, your answers from the previous question, the things that you find meaningful about your job, very much so were not, self-based. And I love that too. They were about impacting the community. So there's absolutely reason to do the hard work and go through the tough situations to make the workplace better for everybody. I absolutely loved all of your answers. All right, I'm gonna skip down a little bit because I really want to get this question before we end. So we'll just do like a quick rapid fire. Your biggest piece of advice, especially for women interested in getting started in environmental science. So maybe like 1 or 2 sentences. Biggest piece of advice, and then we'll get to question and answer if any of our listeners have questions for you guys. All right, Amanda, what is your biggest piece of advice, especially for women getting started in environmental science?
I think I'm just gonna reiterate a couple of things that came up in some of the earlier questions. And so I think what I'll say is follow your passion. It helps. Cece, you just talked about this a little bit, but if you are doing something you love, it helps make it worth all the battles you will face. And, we talked about some of the challenges of being a woman in the workplace, but there's also challenges beyond that. As I do work in climate change and labor issues and toxics and health, like Jamie mentioned as well, those are big issues that people don't want to change because they're making money off of causing that misery. And so being able to find something you're really passionate about tackling so that when you come up against hurdle after hurdle, it still makes it worth coming in. And then just tiny little bit to add to that, Cece, I love what you just said too about the changing of the workplace and changing how these things happen. And that can be in a number of ways. And so I just also want to highlight, there's policy and advocacy. And Jamie, you mentioned specific examples of doing that as well. That those are ways that we can also plug in to make all of this better for us and future generations.
Perfect. I love it. Kat, go for it.
Thanks. Yeah, looking at Jamie and Amanda, I and myself, I think having that breadth is actually just, you don't have to have all the answers right this moment. You don't have to be like, oh, I know I want to be an environmental scientist who looks at air quality or, whatever specific little niche it is. Just if you start broad and then narrow down, and it doesn't matter if you go down some random path. I think breadth is actually incredibly valuable, especially in the workplace. So read lots, go down rabbit holes, nourish your inner nerd. And then I guess pair that with just going to more events like these, talk to people, just develop a big widespread community, and you'll find your tribe, and you'll find, the next place to put the next step. Yeah, that's me.
I love it. Fabulous. Thank you so much, Kat. All right, Jamie, piece of advice for women entering environmental science.
Yeah, I think be flexible, be realistic. I reiterate what Kat and Amanda say, but back to the whole, you don't have to know exactly what you're going to do at 21. I actually think that's ridiculous. And be okay with changing, subfields or jobs. That's also fine too. I thought I would only be happy doing wildlife conservation. I just had to. But as it turns out, I can also be passionate about other things. And so as long as you can find something to believe in that, you can excel at, I think that that's a win.
Perfect. I love it.
I wanted to just add one more thing. Sorry.
Oh, please go for it.
And it's a little bit contradictory to the breadth message that I just said, but I think just start thinking about how to talk about what value you bring as well. Because I think it's something that I've certainly struggled with, because you kind of have to sell yourself a little bit to be successful in some workplaces, not all workplaces. And it's not about being big-headed or anything, or arrogant or anything like that, but just being really confident with the value that you can bring and acknowledging that, and just having a few sentences in the back of your head. You can use ChatGPT to help. That if you are in a situation with someone who you would like to work for, or just someone who you admire, or someone in an interesting field, you can sit back on those. It's just like a little tip more than anything else.
I love it. Oh, that was great. ChatGPT to do your elevator pitch. I love it.
Can I also say one more quick thing? Have
Yes.
yourself a couple of power songs for whether you need to just like pump yourself up or whether you're mad. Like, have that playlist ready.
Amazing. That is great. It's just like life advice. Amazing. Okay. So thank you everyone for tuning in to our Passion for the Planet Environmental Science Careers panel. We hope you guys enjoyed it. We're now going to move into for lack of a better word, confidential. We're going to stop recording so that we can move into question and answer.